You can't play games on a Mac, right? So for as long as I can remember, gaming on Mac computers has always played second fiddle to PC gaming. Even going back to the beige CRT-powered 1990s, the Windows and Intel world was where the big titles launched first. Then, if you were lucky, Mac OS would get a janky port of new games like a year or so later. Gaming was an added bonus that your Mac could sometimes also do, not something you bought a Mac specifically to do. But it's 2025, probably maybe when you're watching this video, and Apple is producing some of the fastest desktop and laptop computers around thanks to its M-series chips. So does Mac gaming still suck? And perhaps just as interestingly, with devices like the M4 Mac Mini available for as little as $600, could this even be a cheeky workaround to play some of the best titles of the 2020s without splurging on a big old PC tower? Well, as you might have guessed by the fact that this video is still going, the answer requires a little investigation and some explanation. So let's get into it. Let's kick it off with the easiest way to play on a Mac, and that is with native Mac versions of games. Apple wants the App Store to be your first port of call for any software, and that includes gaming. And thanks to the architectural similarity between Mac, iPad, and iPhone chips, there is a pretty huge library of casual games that you can choose from. We're using the base model M4 Mac Mini here, representing a decent entry-level starting point for Mac gaming. Obviously, a Studio or a Pro or even a spec'd-out MacBook will see higher performance ceilings in all the titles we're looking at. Graphically, it is a bit tough to nail down exactly how this stacks up against a PC, but in 3D Mark's Wildlife Extreme test, it comes in around the level of an NVIDIA RTX 3050. That's not too shabby considering the price. As you might expect, there are many titles that have trickled down to the Mac from the iPad as opposed to being specifically designed to play on a computer. There are plenty of exceptions though, and Apple has been making efforts to bring more AAA titles to Mac since the arrival of Apple Silicon. The excellent Resident Evil 2 remake ran well at 1080p on my Mac Mini with Metal Effects upscaling set to quality mode, with performance well above 40 FPS most of the time in this cinematic zombie slaying experience. No Man's Sky is another one that's built for Mac and runs excellently on this M4 Mini hardware. I ran the game at Quad HD resolution and maxed out the graphics settings, and the Mac ran the game gracefully, rarely going below 60 FPS. Most of the time I played, it seemed to be around 66, occasionally drifting up towards 70 or 80. This was mostly during the early portions of the game though, so your mileage may vary. The M4 chip also makes short work of two of Apple's hallmark AAA titles on the App Store, namely Death Stranding and Resident Evil Village. If you're happy at 1080p, then both of these games will run at least 60 FPS, sometimes even higher. And my colleague Zhao reported pretty good performance from Shadow of the Tomb Raider, benchmarking at the low 40 FPS range at 1080p with details maxed out. I could go on, but this isn't a benchmarking video and I'm not creating an exhaustive list of games here. Nevertheless, chances are if you can find it on the Mac App Store, it'll offer at least playable frame rates on this M4 Mini at around 1080p. And I was actually surprised by how many big deal titles from the past decade or so I could find on the App Store. Actually, the well-reviewed Civilization 6 arrived same day on Mac alongside Windows when it launched back in 2016. The remastered versions of BioShock 1 and 2 are live on the App Store as well. Even indie classics I wasn't expecting to come across like Limbo and Braid were easy to find. A lot of your creatory multiplayer titles with a big following are covered as well. Roblox and Minecraft both have Mac versions that are both scalable enough to run fine even on entry-level models. Fortnite is the big exception though, having become a victim of the billionaire slap fight between Tim Apple and Tim Epic. Your only option there is cloud gaming, and that's another option that does also fill many of the compatibility gaps that we're going to get into later. However, it's also an argument that applies to pretty much anything with access to a browser. The ability to game through cloud streaming is worth mentioning, but it's hardly something that speaks to the strength of the Mac gaming ecosystem. But still, the idea that you can't game on a Mac is increasingly untrue. In many ways, if the title you want to play is available, especially on the App Store, then getting it up and running is often easier than it would be on a PC. Fewer compatibility issues, no driver weirdness to worry about, no invasive DRM, at least that I could see. For the games on that, for me, surprisingly large list of Mac-friendly titles, that's great. But we're still looking at a subset of the PC gaming library here being available to play easily on a current Mac. And in some ways, Mac gaming has taken a significant step back in recent years. For example, fire up your Steam library on a modern Mac and you'll likely see a bunch of these little warnings. This compatibility barrier effectively blocks hundreds if not thousands of older Mac titles from running easily on modern Apple hardware since the company ditched 32-bit app support back in 2019. Many classics like Half-Life 2, the Portal and Left 4 Dead series are now harder to play on a Mac than they were a decade ago. Which leads us to our next solution solution for expanding our Mac gaming library, Crossover. This is a great little app that's designed to get Windows software, including games, running at near native speed despite the difference between the two platforms. There's an extensive compatibility list available online, and I tried a few titles like Portal 2 and Skyrim Special Edition and found that they ran well at around 2.5K resolution with high details. A little bit of mouse lag was the only real issue I ran into in Portal. This is emulation though, which of course means your mileage may vary, but Crossover is being actively developed with updates and improvements coming all the time. Crossover costs £60 here in the UK, basically the equivalent of one AAA game purchase, so if you've got a large back catalogue on something like Steam that you want to try playing on a Mac like this, I think it's a decent investment. Your next option if Crossover doesn't work is to emulate a full Windows PC instance on your Mac using something like Parallels. This is an extreme solution for most people because it involves buying more expensive software and a full Windows license to use on your virtual machine. Plus there's the added performance hit that you get with this kind of fully loaded emulation. It's an extreme step that comes with no guarantees of compatibility, but for older titles or if you've just got a massively spec'd out Mac, it could be an option. Apps like Parallels and Crossovers are still emulation, and the games I used with Crossover aren't exactly among the most demanding PC titles out there. So if you're thinking about trying to emulate something like Cyberpunk 2077, then don't. Wait for the official Mac port, hopefully arriving sometime before 2077. Even with emulation options like this, you'll still find some gaps in your library. Doom Eternal, for example, is currently no-go, even on a fully fledged VM, and although the remastered versions of the first two BioShock games are easily playable on Mac, the underappreciated third entry, BioShock Infinite, won't run in Crossover, being marked as having limited functionality on version 25 at the time of talking. So when it comes to gaming on a Mac right now, this is basically the flowchart that your brain needs to go through. Okay, is there a native Mac version? A lot of the time, probably not. Is one even coming? If so, you've got to wait. Is it on the compatibility list for Crossover? Maybe, but if it's a new title, maybe not. And if not, your only option is to use a VM with all the hassle, cost, and performance loss that entails. The situation is not unlike the world of Snapdragon PCs. Laptops using Qualcomm's latest X Elite chip can game surprisingly well through the Prism compatibility layer, but there are still issues, and most titles do take a pretty big performance hit. Gaming isn't something you buy a Snapdragon PC for, it's an added bonus. It's gravy. If you're focused on a small handful of titles and those happen to run well natively on Apple Silicon or even through Crossover, then great. Even so though, you're still dealing with much more limited options, just a subset of the vast PC gaming library, as was the case way back in the 2000s. All of which might make it seem like we are in a very similar situation with Mac gaming to where we were a couple of decades ago, but I don't think that's quite true, and it undersells the efforts of both Apple and developers. Mac gaming benefits directly and indirectly from the massive user base of the iPhone and iPad, not just in having those titles available on a bigger screen, but also getting the tools required to build great Mac games in the hands of more developers. As a result of that, and things like Apple's game porting toolkit, there are more big-name AAA titles available for macOS than ever before, as well as indie offerings both modern and vintage. Gaming still isn't something you buy a Mac specifically for. It is an added bonus, but there is still a lot that you can play compared to a generation or so ago, not just in terms of games published by Apple or natively supporting Apple Silicon, but thanks to things like Crossover taking advantage of the power of those M-series chips to brute force extra game compatibility through emulation. Mac gaming may still be a joke to the PC crowd, but I don't think it's quite as funny as it was a couple of decades ago. That's it for now. If you've got a recent Mac, then hit the comments and let me know if you've gotten around to doing any gaming on it, and especially if you've had to grapple with any compatibility issues. Stick around and subscribe for more. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.